say I'm a professor of philosophy, not really of Jewish studies, even though I direct the program. That's somewhat important because what I know best is I think about texts in a sort of conceptual way more than in a sort of historical way, which is the way Jewish studies usually goes. But we can talk about all that some other time. I'm dropping two handouts into the chat so that you can follow along with them if you like. I'll also put them up at least periodically on the screen. So I think sometimes it's nice to not be looking at a screen, and I'll go back to that. But I will at least. Shayna, I'm afraid you need to let me share my screen.
I'm so sorry. That was one of the things we were supposed to do. Try now.
Yes, looks like it works. Okay, so I promised, at least originally, that I would talk about both two non-Jews who are important on Shavuot. One is Ruth, who of course we read, whose book we read tomorrow, and the other is Yithro or Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who shows up in the parsha from which the revelation on Mount Sinai, in which that takes place, although we don't read the part about Yithro tomorrow, we read it during the year. The parsha, in fact, is called Yithro, as many of you probably know, and we get to the revelation on Sinai only after a conversation, which I think is often overlooked, but very interesting, between Moses and his father-in-law. I'm going to start with this text. You all see one that says Ruth at the top and then Jethro second, is that right? Number one says Ruth and then number two says Jethro? Okay, good. Thanks for the wave, that's actually helpful. So I'm going to say less about Ruth, partly because I want to say quite a lot about Yithro, but also because a very beautiful essay that says more than I can say tonight about Ruth, that I very helpful for the purposes for which I'm bringing these texts in, was written for Shavuot by Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who is a co-founder of the organization Roots or Shorashim and Judur, which is a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group and does a lot of work between settlers and Palestinians, something of which I was originally quite suspicious, but actually they really do very powerful and moving stuff. And I've put a link to his piece on Ruth into the handout. You can see it there under My Jewish Learning. And I'll just mention briefly what he says, but then really mostly move on. However, I wanted to mention a couple of other things about Ruth. So we read Ruth tomorrow. There's a lot of debate about why we're reading Ruth on Shavuot. It's a beautiful story. It seems to be set around our time of year. That might be one reason. There are other reasons why it's suited to the season. But one thing that is often mentioned is that whether or not there's anything explicitly like conversion in the book of Ruth, the moment when Ruth says she will come back and join her mother-in-law, Naomi, and says, your home will be my home, your God will be my God, that is taken as the model of what conversion is supposed to be. She's a Moabitess, but she comes to join the Jewish people, and she's a model of a convert. But then why are we reading about conversion on Shavuot? And one suggestion I have is that coming, and I'm not alone in saying this, coming to Sinai is like conversion. That in a sense, we all converted at Sinai. And of course, by the same token, a convert is coming to Sinai, right? So there's a deep connection between those two ideas. A second thought about Ruth, which I haven't really seen spelled out, but it seems to me to capture the book pretty well, is Ruth seems a joyful, life-affirming character. Her mother-in-law, certainly when they come back, having suffered a lot of tragedy, is not. She asks the villagers around her to call her Mara, bitterness, because her life is bitter. And by the end of the book, partly because she marries a nice Jewish guy, a wealthy Jewish guy as well, and gives her a grandchild, she brings joy back to Naomi. Naomi becomes Naomi, the joyful one again, through Ruth. And in a lot of ways, she seems also to bring joy to Boaz both before he marries her and afterwards. So there's a way in which Ruth helps these Jews find joy in being Jews again. These Israelites find joy in being Israelites again. And I want to suggest that in both of these respects, Ruth represents a way in which non-Jews, certainly non-Jews who embrace our tradition, can help us see the beauty in it more than we do ourselves. And I actually would say personally, I have had this experience quite often when I encounter a convert particularly, but often also when I meet a non-Jew, and I have Christian and Muslim friends like this who see a lot of beauty in our religion. And I think, oh, I'm constantly criticizing things we do, especially in the context of J Street and in other critical discussions of Israel. And it's very nice to have our tradition affirmed by non-Jews. So in this way, in just a very obvious sense, we can see ourselves affirmed in the eyes of non-Jews. And what Rabbi Schlesinger suggests very beautifully is that Boaz, who is taken in the Midrash to have actually changed Jewish law or come up with a solution to a problem in Jewish law, because officially, if you look in the Torah, we're not supposed to be marrying to the people of Moab. And Boaz, according to the Midrash, sort of notes that the language is masculine, not feminine, and he says, well, a woman can't marry a Moabite man, but a man can marry a Moabite woman, and thereby he changes something in the law. Without going into the details of that, what Rabbi Schlesinger says about that, which I think is quite beautiful, is that the encounter with Ruth, the human being, with this non-Jewish person who is a very beautiful, joyful person, that helped Boaz see that the law cannot be understood as it had been understood that way. It couldn't be God's will, that we can't possibly marry these people. And the idea that the encounter with human beings, period, it should be a motivating force in how we understand Jewish law, I think is a very powerful one. That encounter can be sometimes quite powerful with a non-Jew particularly. I think that's another thing to add. So with that in mind, let's turn to Yithro, who is a priest of Midian. And the first thing that happened, he comes to see Moses after the Exodus from Egypt in the beginning of Exodus chapter 19. And the first thing he does is celebrate the Exodus as much as any Jew has. And he says, Baruch Elohim, blessed be God. He blesses God before Moses. He prays. The first person who prays in the entire Torah is Abraham's non-Jewish servant Eliezer. So it is kind of interesting that blessing and praise to God is often put into the mouth of non-Jews in the Torah. And then Yithro notices that Moses is judging the entire community all by himself, settling all their disputes. He thinks that's not a good idea. He suggests that Moses sets up a sort of judicial system where decentralizes, sets up other judges, and that seems to be a good idea. It works out well, and that Moses would only handle the difficult cases. The point I want to stress about that is what he's essentially doing is democratizing the community, at least to a certain degree. He's at least encouraging kind of devolution of power, decentralization of power, so that Moses ceases to be the only Israelite with a connection to God, and instead that spreads out among the people. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that only after that does Sinai happen. It may be that only once the people in a larger sense, not fully, certainly, but once ordinary other Israelites become judges, only then does it become possible to think that God could speak to the whole people and not just to Moses. So in a way, Yithro lays the groundwork for Moses to start the revelation, as it were. But I now want to focus in on just two verses in what Yithro says. That will take us also to the other handout that I have. But let's look first at those verses. I'm hoping they pop up. Are you now seeing an excerpt from Sefaria with a couple of verses? No?
No, not yet.
Let me see if I have to go back and
Share a different screen.
share and then share something else. Let's see if I can do this. How's this? Is this helping?
Yes. You have success.
Yes. Okay. Great. So it's just a couple of verses here. Yithro says to Moses, there's some stuff before this. This is when he's coming to him to get him to decentralize, and he says, Ata shema b'kolil. Now, listen to me. Listen to my voice. Iatzcha, I'm going to counsel you. Vihi Elohim imach. I'm going to counsel you, and let God be with you. It sounds as if God's going to be with you if I counsel you. So this non-Jew has the chutzpah to tell Moses, only after I give you counsel will God be with you. At least so this is suggested. And of course, the Torah itself is endorsing what happens here. This is a positive event. So it does sound as if this non-Jew is helping Moses come closer to God. That in itself, I think, is interesting. But let's go on. Heye ata le'am, you be for the mul Elohim, you be for the people before God. You represent them, or something like that. Veheveta ata et hadvarim el ha'elohim, you and bring the causes, the things, the dvarim, presumably the disputes before God. V'hishartet hem et hachukim ve'et hatorot, and warn them, or as we'll see later on, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch suggests, and enlighten them, picking up on the connection, or at least affinity between Hishartem and Zohar, light. You enlighten them about the chukim and the Torah, the statutes and the teachings, the hodata lahem, and make known to them et haderech yelchuva, at the way in which they should go, the derech, vet hamaseh asher yasun, and the practices they are to follow. Okay, there's more that he says, but he goes on immediately really to the judicial suggestion. But I want now to turn to something quite interesting and in its way rather odd that the Talmud does with this text. Now, are you now seeing what Yithro taught?
Yes.
Is that what's showing up?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Okay.
That.
So at the top of it, the first quotation is what I just read to you, although I wanted to give you the Hebrew as well to let the language sink in. Now listen to me, I'll give you counsel, God be with you, you be for the people, etc. Now here is what the Talmud in Baba Metzia 30b does with that. It takes every phrase, and I'm not going to say that there's a very clear argument for why it reads the phrases it does, but it connects a different teaching to each phrase. And what's interesting is what the teachings are that it connects. For Rav Yosef taught, and you shall make known to them. Okay? This refers to their house of life. Strange phrase, Beit Chayehem, which is understood by Rashi to mean the way of making a living. And that's the way people understand it. It seems plausible. Now, you shall make known to them, the next phrase is the way, and they read the way, that is derech, as the practice of gemilut chasidim, loving kindness. They should walk, that's the way they should walk. This is Bikur Choli, visiting the sick, in which this is burial. Very hard to see how they get that, but let's just take that for granted. And what I do want to add here, that the Talmud goes on to ask the question, why do they say why do they pick out visiting the sick and burial separately? Because aren't those part of Gemilut Chasidim? Those are parts of doing loving kindness, right? Standardly, we understand practices of loving kindness to include visiting the sick and burying the dead. And they say in the extension of this discussion, which I haven't given you in the Talmud, that the reason those things are added is that you should visit the sick even if that to some extent puts you in danger. The example they give is someone who is born under the same star as the sick person. I don't want to be misunderstood in the midst of this crisis. I realize I'm not by any means suggesting that anyone should visit the sick in COVID-19 when you run a risk of getting the illness. But if there's some kind of relatively mild risk, you should still visit the sick, says the Talmud. And as for burial, well, it's considered beneath the dignity of an elder to bury the dead. That's not really the thing they should do. But in some cases, they may be the only person to do it. And the Talmud says, even in that case, when it's at the cost of their dignity, they should engage in burying the dead. And I stress this because, as we'll see in a moment, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who we're going to come to at the end, makes a lot of the fact that the Talmud stresses that you should carry out loving kindness here. They say, see, Yithro is saying, you should practice loving kindness even at the cost of significant self-sacrifice. All right, to go on with the text. And the work, this is the law that they should do. This is what's called in the Talmud, lifnim mishurat hadin, going above and beyond the law, beyond the requirements of the law. And then there's a beautiful additional teaching, which I'm not going to stress here. That could be another class too, but I do want to mention it because it's put in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that Jerusalem was destroyed because the judges gave judgments in accordance with biblical law, to which the Talmud answers in sort of perplexity, almost outrage. Were they then supposed to have judged in accordance with untrained arbitrator? What are they supposed to do? Aren't you supposed to judge in accordance with the Torah? But the Talmud answers his own question. The problem is that they based themselves upon the law and never went beyond the letter of the law, beyond the requirements of the law. They went strictly by deen, by what people's rights were, and they never went lifnim mishurat hadin. And there is a teaching, actually, as you can see, it says that Jerusalem was destroyed. There's an interpretation of the verse such that if everybody just insists on their rights, then society will be destroyed. It's a very interesting response to certain kinds of if I may say so, libertarian ways of conceiving the world here. Unless people are willing to compromise sometimes on their rights, unless they're willing to look for solidarity with their neighbors, even when they have a right to insist on what's good for themselves, then society will be destroyed. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is suggesting here. Okay, so we have this teaching that is linked to what Yithro says, taking what he's telling Moses to be, teach them how to make a living, how to care lovingly for their neighbors, even at the cost of their own sacrifice to themselves sometimes, and that they should go beyond the letter, they should obey the law, but also be willing to go beyond the letter of the law. That is the basis on which Shimshon Raphael Hirsch makes the following, I think, quite remarkable claim. He expands that idea in the following, I think, quite remarkable way. So let's look at the third teaching and then come back to basically where he will end, why this is put in the mouth of Yithro, the non-Jew. So Hirsch says, commenting on the Talmud's use of this verse, teach them that their work, their beit chayehem, their way they make a living, which is usually so concentrated on ourselves. It's what we do out of self-interest, how we take care of ourselves and our families. We don't have to care about anybody else, right? But teach them that that very work must not only include benevolent care for the well-being of our fellow people, but that this benevolent care for others is the real purpose of our working for ourselves. That is, why should you make a living? Because that will help you help others. Left to himself, an unenlightened person takes the purpose of his derech, his way through life, remember that's a word from the verses, to be purely his own advantage. But hodata lahem, teach them, when you enlighten them, they will look on their existence and livelihood as being only for the benefit of others. And equally so, enlighten them concerning their deeds as between man and man. So he connects this now to the second half, the part about law and going beyond the letter of the law. The ordinary standard by which a person measures his dealings with his fellows is at best the standard of strict justice and correct honesty. That's insisting on your own rights. And at best, respecting the rights of others as well. But he forgets that something may be in itself strictly fair and correct, while nevertheless, out of consideration for his own personal worth and the mission of self-sacrificing love which is attached to his own personality, much more can he be bound to do. This is the teaching to bring Gemilut Chesed into Deen. So he's combining now the two parts of the teaching, the one about loving kindness and the one about rights. love into rights, which the judge may not demand, but which those who would be righteous are to dictate to themselves. So I think he's partly drawing all this from the fact that the Talmud itself says you have to carry out loving kindness even at the cost of your own self-interest, even when it requires some kind of sacrifice. And what Hirsch is suggesting is that that should take place both in your everyday relations with one another and when you come to the law. That when you come to the law, you should be seeing the law as not just serving your own rights and your own, what you can insist on, but the rights of others and the needs of others as well. Yithro thinks that this teaching concerning the very highest level of our moral mission too must come from Moses himself. This is what Hirsch is saying, that Yithro, he understands Yithro is teaching Moses about what the highest level of our mission is, or at least that he has to teach this. And Yithro knows it, and Yithro tells him to teach this. If this event occurred, says Hirsch, as we presume it did before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, there is some dispute, which I won't get into, about where it takes place, but certainly it's placed in the Torah before Revelation. It is all the more understandable that the way they are to go and the deeds they are to do are taken by the Gemara to refer primarily to general human behavior and duties. That is, and this is the main thing I want to take away, this very humane teaching that we should have a living, make our living in order to benefit others and not just ourselves. That we should pursue justice beyond our own rights for the sake of others and not just for ourselves. Hirsch is suggesting that it had to come from a makes sense that it comes from a non-Jew, because after all, he doesn't know the whole Torah. Yithro is just talking about general humane morality, general humanism. And I want to suggest that maybe it had to come from a non-Jew. Because after all, what do we Jews share with non-Jews? General moral principles, like caring for others and not just insisting on our own rights, but also, of course, acting according to law as well as beyond the law. Taking care of people, including visiting the sick and burying those who have passed, even at the cost of some of our own interests. These are general forms of humanity which we share with others and which we can therefore learn from non-Jews, and we may understand best when we don't think this is just a Jewish thing, but when we think it is a kind of humanity that everyone ought to have. It may be necessary that this comes from a non-Jew. It may make sense. The Torah may have a point in putting this into the mouth of a non-Jew before we ever get the Torah. Because that way, first of all, this general moral standard, we know we have to live up to whatever we do. And secondly, it helps us understand the Torah itself. It helps us interpret the Torah's laws. So on this picture, we Jews need to live with and learn from non-Jews as well. They help remind us that many of our highest principles, including ones which we need to interpret our own Torah, have to be shared by humanity in general and not just come from the Jewish special teaching that we think we got from God. Now, let me suggest that we can extend these points yet further, just as the Talmud extends the Torah and Hirsch extends the Talmud. Let's take it one step further and suggest that just as our Torah, as we can move from our Torah, our teaching, to a Torah or teaching that can enable us to serve all humanity, even at the cost of some of our own personal interests, perhaps we also should understand our national project, our Zionism, our building of our own homeland as something that should require us to learn from non-Jews, but also that doesn't make sense unless we are also serving the national interests of other people, and especially the national interests of other people who live among us. So we can, I think, or at least it's not implausible, that we can extend what Hirsch is teaching to the national level. that just as our own national health, our own personal health and our own personal well-being should be for the sake of others, and we should insist on our own rights, but also be willing to work beyond them and know that we can't just insist on our own rights. So on the national level, our building our own nation should be something that is done for the sake of others as well as ourselves. And of course, especially those others that we constantly affect by living with them and among them. So obviously, I mean the Palestinians, above all, not only. And we should insist on our own rights, but not insist on them at the cost of going lifnim mishorat hadin in the international world and in our political relationships. That is, that we are called on to compromise and to look out for the national interests and the national rights of others, and also their national well-being, even when it goes beyond rights. So I think all of these teachings about the importance of non-Jews to Jews, both Ruth and Yithro, both I think can set, as it were, a base level for how we understand what the Torah is, and politically can be useful for understanding what our relationship to non-Jews who live in and amongst us today in the land of Israel. So that's pretty much what I have to say. I see a comment from Joshua Green. One might also interpret the Talmud as advocating judges to show some flexibility in the law. So that goes very well with what I was stressing at the end of the talk on going lifnim mishorat hadin rather than just insisting on one's strict rights. I don't see any other comments in the chat right now. I guess I should have said at the beginning that I'm very happy to take questions in the chat. I was hoping to end my presentation part a little bit early, as I have. So as to open it up now for more discussion, anything that people want to talk about, either as regards the texts themselves or as regards their implications for present day understanding of the Torah generally, but also of politics. So I guess I'll pause for a minute to see whether anybody wants to ask questions. Is somebody? Oh, yeah. Okay, Sheila.
Can I ask a question?
I guess I could see that. Yes.
Pardon?
Yes, Sheila, go ahead.
So, I just got my internet connection is unstable. So, I'm a convert. And my conflict is I always want to help other people rather than put on my own oxygen mask. Can you speak to that? Because if you don't put on your own oxygen mask, that means you're not taking, other people are going to have to take care. Can you help me with that?
Well, I think you got your own answer to your question, which I entirely agree with. I always loved that announcement, although it's disturbing in the plane when they tell you put your own mask on first before helping others, meaning even your own kids, if you have small kids. But it's true if you don't put your own oxygen mask on, then you may very quickly be unable to help anyone and you actually put a burden on others. So I think we do need to insist on taking care of ourselves. And I do think Hirsch, to some extent, goes too far when he says that one's work, one's beit chayehim, one's livelihood that is the real purpose of our working for ourselves. Well, I don't know, maybe that's okay, but it sounds sometimes as if he's saying that's the only reason you should be working. And the full comment in the Talmud, which I think on the whole Hirsch agrees with, involves taking care of yourself and insisting on your own rights. You don't just let yourself be trampled over, but also using your own health, your own well-being to help others. Recognizing that what's good, your goods, what's good for you, your wealth, your health, etc., that is a tool by which you can help others. But you need to keep that tool going. You can't just give up on it. You can't just put yourself into poverty, which is something that the Rambam actually seriously disapproves of, then you're only making yourself somebody that others need to help, and that isn't helping others. And also in terms of rights, it's not that we simply give up our rights, it's that we seek compromise where we can afford it, basically, where we can live with it. We don't just ask people in a political context to kill us, and in a personal context, you don't say, well, go take my house. But where compromise is possible, that's something we should seek. So Joshua has a great question. How should we deal with non-Jews who don't want to show mutual consideration towards Jews? It's very difficult. And I don't want to say that I have a simple answer to that. I think part of my answer would be tied to what I just said to Sheila, which is that we do still need to preserve ourselves. We need to be alive, and we need to be Jewish. We're not giving that up. And I think in the modern day, we also need to have a homeland, some kind of political independence, even though I personally would like to see at this point our affirming the national rights, the national aspirations of Palestinians as well. I don't think that those two things have to be incompatible. And so one answer to your question is we should be seeking non-Jews who do want to show mutual consideration towards Jews. And one of the tragedies, moral, I think, failures of our community over the last 30 years is that we have been turning those people away rather than working with them. But also we need to recognize, particularly when we're talking about non-Jews who are much weaker than we are, that sometimes we have put them in a situation where they don't want to show mutual consideration towards us. If we constantly slap them down and mistreat them, no wonder they are angry with us. But then at the end of the day, certainly, I should add one other point there, because we have greater power, we can afford to show greater generosity, and we haven't generally done that. But we can't show generosity to the point in which we let them kill us. So it's a balance between showing the generosity and at the same time respecting ourselves.
I agree. If I can just jump in here,
yeah.
I'd like to suggest two different kinds of interactions. Obviously, here in the United States, I'd argue people who are post-college, who are living in communities, often have very positive relations with non-Jews. I know in my neighborhood, I'm from Northern Virginia, we had tremendous support when, actually twice, our JCC was vandalized. And we Jews, in turn, have supported Muslims who have had difficulty getting zoning rights for their mosques and so on. I sat on the board of our JCC. I remember passing a resolution in support of Muslims being granted, for example, parking rights and the like. At the same time, we're also aware of difficult situations on college campuses. You may see this at your university. I know I read about it all the time, of Jewish students in various ways being harassed by opponents of Israel who are not willing to engage in what, I don't know, outsiders might call a fair debate, a reasoned debate, or something like that. And the question then is, what's an appropriate response? We want to continue to be open and welcoming to discussion, but if the other side isn't interested in that, what's the appropriate response?
Good. So I should say, first of all, I teach at a large commuter institution, and I think the vast majority of my students are first generation. I teach at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Vast majority of my students are first generation college students. They're there to get a professional degree. I think something like 75% are pre-health. So we do not have a whole lot of people demonstrating against Israel all the time, because that's not what they came to college for. It's the more elite schools where people, have the time to do that, and so forth. We do get it somewhat. We have an Israel Apartheid Week. I barely notice it, I must say. I have rarely encountered this. Now, I would also say I started a Jewish Muslim initiative at my university in 2005, which is still running. I think it's the longest running Jewish Muslim initiative at any university at this point. Others started before us but closed. And that's been my response. And that means precisely that I actually work with people who want to talk to us. And we also had some discussions about Israel with a variety of speakers. We had a series once called Thinking Out of the Box on Israel-Palestine, in which we brought Peter Beinart, we brought some more, we actually brought an Arab figure, Hussein Ibish, who is a big two-state guy, and at the same time we brought some Jewish anti-Zionists, religious anti-Zionists. You may even know them. Chip Manikin at the University of Maryland, and Yitzhak Melamed. And we also, we had discussions from a variety of perspectives. And guess what? None of the people who really reject Israel showed up. I did get Muslim students who I'd had personally in my class come to the sessions and liked them very much. So that's basically my suggestion. We need to reach out to those who are willing to talk to us. And then I think this is the one other point I'd make. I'm getting the warning that we're coming close to the end here. I think it's implicit and maybe even explicit in some of the texts I showed that if you spend all your time insisting on your rights, then others will do that for themselves too. If all we Jews talk about is anti-Semitism, 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 all we talk about is how bad everybody is to us, the other groups will say, well, look how bad you are to us, or they'll only be interested in themselves. We need to start with a certain generosity, and we can afford that, especially in America. And I think that's one of the teachings we can come away with from Hirsch's reading of Yithro, Hirsch's reading through the Talmud. And in fact, one of the things about these texts is they very beautifully show, as somebody said in the chat, how much the Torah itself seems to urge us to look out for the non-Jews who do want to work with us, be generous to them, learn what we can, recognize what we can learn from them. And then also, certainly as Hirsch reads it, recognize how much we need to reach out beyond our own self-interest if we even want that self-interest to be satisfied. To have a Beit Chayenu, to have a house of life of our own, a derech of our own, we need to be generous. We need to be looking out to the other rather than constantly worried about what's happening to us ourselves. That doesn't mean giving up on self-defense, but it does mean taking a certain risk in reaching out more than we might think we can. So Shana, is this a good time to call it quits?
Yes, I want to thank you so much on behalf of J Street and PPI and Amenu and Shura and NAF, Yasher Koach, and I love the idea of we need to come from a place of generosity and not think that everyone is after us. So Sam, thank you so much. For those of you that are wondering where to go next, I'm again going to put in the chat, you now have 3 choices. I'm going to put the website in and you can go back. Again, for security purposes, you have to re-register into the Zoom, and we're going to start the next session at 8:50 Eastern. So we have about 9 minutes to stretch your legs. So Sam, Yasher Koach, thank you all so much.
You're welcome. Chag Sameach to everybody.